There's a lump at the back of your throat. You know the gravitas of it all. And you go into the room there, you take the oath, and that's it. It's over. You're like thinking, really?
Meet Dom Mason. He is from Manchester, UK, and has been living in Singapore for 33 years, and this year he obtained Singaporean citizenship. Dom builds brands, and he's the mind behind VivoCity name. He shared with me his thoughts on the difficult decision to give up the UK passport, the arrogance of Westerners in Singapore, and the prospect of retiring in Penang, Malaysia. I'm Max, an entrepreneur and YouTuber. Let's go.
I arrived in 1989 when Lee Kuan Yew was still the Prime Minister of Singapore. I think I arrived on the same day that they banned smoking in air-conditioned places. I wasn't sure how long I would last here. But you know the story. 1 year becomes 2 years, becomes 5, and then before you know it, it's 20, 30 years later.
Why Singapore in the first place?
I didn't have Singapore in mind specifically. I knew that the world was bigger than Manchester, than the UK. I remember reading a National Geographic magazine in the year that I was graduating, and I had an article on Singapore. And this article had this beautiful tropical metropolis. And I remember one image in particular, and it was this big apartment block with washing poles sticking out. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was a HDB estate. And I thought, well, that's an intriguing place to go to.
Was it difficult for you to adapt to local lifestyle after living in Manchester?
The first barrier that you have is navigating the language of food. I'm sure when you went into a hawker center for the first time, you were kind of mesmerized, like, what is all this? It's like an adventure.
Yeah, no idea. Like, well, why not?
But you don't know what it's called, you don't know how to order it, you don't know the language of food here. So that's something that you have to learn.
You into local food or not?
I would say most of it, yeah.
Yeah.
I do like durian, which durian still surprises Singaporeans.
Not many, let's say, foreigners or like Caucasians love durian. You one of them, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think that if it's about the smell, then sambal belacan is quite strong. And there's this thing called, I think it's called Taiwanese tofu, which I think takes first place. I'm happy with durian.
I guess it's a big difference, life in Manchester, life in Singapore. Like, what's the, let's say, differences, bigger differences?
The first thing has to be the weather. I mean, I don't know if you spent much time in the UK, but it can be quite wet, it can be quite grey, it can be quite cold. And so when I first came, I actually really enjoyed the weather. Yeah. I got a bit upset during the weekends when it was raining because it meant that I couldn't experience Singapore. I have to be honest, 30 years later, I'm starting to feel the heat. And I don't know if it's since I became a Singapore citizen or if it's really about climate change, but I find myself complaining a lot nowadays, like most Singaporeans do, about the weather.
You became Singaporean this year.
I did.
Tell me how you came to this decision. You always want to become Singaporean, or at some point you decided?
I think because I married a Singaporean and have a family, I think that's the first thing that starts to create a bond, a deeper bond with any place. And Singapore is a special case. And then there comes a point where you realize I've lived half my life out here. And you speak to younger colleagues at the time, and the conversation is, how long have you been out here? And I say, well, actually, probably longer than you have. And they, as young Singaporeans.
Yeah.
And then I think the tipping points, perhaps for me, from the UK, Brexit in 2016. I had no idea what was happening there. I was quite confused by it. I still am. And I think some people in the UK are starting to shift their opinions around Brexit. But the real tipping point was, I think, COVID. I'm not sure if you were here during COVID, but experiencing it from a Singapore-based perspective, comparing it to how other countries, other cities were dealing with it, realizing that actually this is the good place to be when this kind of thing happens. The Singapore passport, a lot of people talk about how powerful that is. And I think at the moment it's the most powerful passport in the world. But for me, it's also about, let's say something happens in a foreign country and you need to seek assistance or consular services. I would say that it's not a bad place to go, the Singapore Embassy or the Singapore Consulate or the High Commission. So it's more than just a passport. For me, it is a place with a lot of meaning, a lot of connections.
Was it hard feelings when you needed to give up your UK passport? What did you feel about it?
Taking on citizenship is something that you will probably do perhaps once, maybe twice in your life. You could get married 4 times and you could change your citizenship. So there is a huge process that you have to go through. For a British person to give up their citizenship nowadays, it's quite administrative. You literally have to just send your passport in, your renunciation form, you pay for the privilege of giving it up, but nobody wants to interview you, ask you the reasons why. You're kind of thinking, well, this is not what you expect. Interestingly, when you go through the process of applying, you have to complete a lot of administrative forms. You have to go to the ICA building in Lavender multiple times, talk to people. But on that day when you go there and you know you have to say your oath, you turn up at that building with something tight in your stomach, there's a lump at the back of your throat, you know the gravitas of it all. And you go into the room there, you take the oath, I think you sign a declaration, and that's it. It's over. Were you like thinking, really? Well, I was waiting for a big guy with a firm handshake to come out and say, welcome for coming on board. But, you know, perhaps the tears will come when there's the citizenship ceremony.
How people react when they know that you're Singaporean?
I don't think it's something that you sort of wave in people's faces. If they ask you, then you tell them. In most cases, there's quite a good smile on their face. They don't sort of make a big deal out of it. They sort of realize, okay, you made a good decision. Even though you could be white, your mannerisms, the way you deal with people, local people, the inflection and some of the way you express things, not to say you have to speak English all the time, but it's understanding the nuances, I think, of local behaviors, mannerisms and culture.
Do you think your personality shaped after 33 years in Singapore?
Absolutely. I think a lot of Westerners, perhaps British people in general, can take a little bit of an arrogant perspective over what was a former colony. You know, they can become a little bit high-caused, a little bit vocal. I think what it does, living amongst diverse community here, is it teaches you to show respect, teaches you to be very careful how you communicate, don't raise your voice, don't get angry. So in a way, it has a calming effect after a number of years.
What's the most interesting project that you've done?
Are you familiar with VivoCity? Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. VivoCity used to be the World Trade Center, and it was this place where they'd have furniture exhibitions and conventions and things like that. So the land was acquired by this developer, and they decided to build this shopping center. And the company I work for got the job to brand it, and it was going to be called, I think, Harbourfront Mall. Our first sort of advice to the client was, well, you've got this beautiful flowing architecture, which was done by the late Toyo Ito, a Japanese architect. And his design was based on, you know, the feng shui of Mount Faber, which is behind. So almost flowing down from Mount Faber into the sort of tributaries before it gets to the...
I didn't know that.
So we said, look, we think you need a name which will stand out. We recommended this name, VivoCity. Because it's linked to the idea of vivacity, which means liveliness and vivaciousness. In French, you have vivre, which is life. But the initial reaction from the client was, oh, no, we can't call it that. Well, we said, why? And one of their responses was, well, there's no V in the Chinese language. We said, okay, but, you know, people know brands like Visa, Volvo, Louis Vuitton. So what we did is we went back and we went into the heartlands, the HDB estates, and we had the typical placard with the name VivoCity, and we did Vox Pops. You know Vox Pops, where you put something in front of people and you want a reaction. And we found that not only could Singaporeans pronounce the name Vivo, but they started playing with it. And that was all we needed to go back to the client and say, no, I think you should seriously consider this, which obviously they did. And one of the interesting stories afterwards, when Vivo opened, was that people found it very hard to navigate the space because most Singapore malls are very box-shaped, and you just went up, 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 down, down, down. And this was a completely new experience, which people are, I think, completely used to now. But at the time, it was quite different. Yeah.
Are you going to retire in Singapore? Do we have any plans?
We had a trip to Penang in Malaysia in June when my daughter came back from university in the UK. I don't think you could find a place that's as similar to Singapore in terms of its culture, its food, its people, its shared history in a way than Penang. So if I were to retire with my family overseas, then that would probably be the first choice.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thanks for watching the next video. Yeah, right here, this one. Thank you again and see you there.